Have you ever imagined that a deep-rooted friendship between neighboring nations could shatter almost overnight, leaving entire industries on the brink of crisis? That is exactly what is unfolding in a sudden and staggering trade war between the United States and Canada, where tariffs are being used like weapons in a standoff. Neither side seems willing to de-escalate. It all began when the White House announced a bold move: a 25% tariff on Canadian imports, including steel, aluminum, and other industrial goods. Officials claimed this was necessary to protect American industries and address security concerns along the northern border. The broader effect spread faster than anyone anticipated, pulling in everything from agricultural products to the tourism industry. Almost immediately, Canada responded with its own 25% tariff on an array of American goods, valued at nearly $30 billion US. British Columbia, serving as a gateway for shipments to Alaska, introduced the possibility of imposing additional fees on commercial trucks traveling through its territory. This extraordinary step sent shockwaves across Alaskan communities dependent on overland routes. Alaska's economy relies heavily on the trade corridor that cuts through British Columbia, with roughly 80% of supplies from the lower 48 states traveling this path. When BC hinted at extra charges for American cargo, small towns feared skyrocketing prices. Grocery stores in Alaska already showed the fallout. Essentials like milk, fresh meat, and vegetables grew more expensive by the day. Residents in remote locations found themselves stuck between paying inflated prices and reducing basic necessities. Tourism also took a blow. Many cruise lines bound for scenic Alaskan ports must stop in Canada under maritime regulations. Canadian authorities could impose new taxes or requirements on these vessels, making tickets costlier and travel plans uncertain. On the other side of the border, Canadian officials framed these tariffs as a necessary defense of sovereignty. Yet they acknowledged that Canada could not entirely escape damage from the escalating conflict. Both economies are woven into global supply chains. The European Union, already clashing with Washington over other tariffs, also introduced countermeasures worth billions of dollars. This sparked worldwide anxiety and raised concerns about how one dispute might ignite broader economic turbulence. Financial markets reacted sharply. Major stock indices saw triple-digit drops in a single day, with investors unnerved by policy unpredictability. Big industries pushed Washington for clarity, but a detailed economic plan never materialized. Surprisingly, the White House pivoted to other talking points. The president praised high-profile American entrepreneurs instead of providing a robust crisis strategy. Critics saw this as a distraction from the market turmoil and the looming economic strain. Public interest soared when a close presidential advisor floated the startling proposal of annexing Canada as the 51st state. Canadian leaders immediately condemned the notion, reaffirming their sovereignty while global media outlets questioned America's intentions. Meanwhile, the energy sector felt tremors. The U.S. imports a significant portion of its crude oil from Canada. Even the hint of reduced Canadian oil exports triggered a spike in gas prices, reflecting deep reliance on cross-border energy routes. Farmers also found themselves cornered. China, reacting to tariffs on its own exports, began sourcing agricultural goods elsewhere. American producers suddenly faced shrinking demand, surplus stock, and plummeting profits. Canada seized opportunities with China and Europe, boosting sales of wheat, beef, and energy products. Ironically, the U.S. tariffs accelerated Canada's move toward new global partnerships, lessening its reliance on American consumers. Within the United States, anxiety intensified as budget cuts began hitting education and public services. The Department of Education announced plans to reduce its workforce by nearly half, alarming parents worried about special needs support and teacher shortages. A growing wave of Americans, from software engineers to scientists, explored emigrating. Immigration firms in Canada and Europe reported a surge in applications from people seeking more predictable political climates and broader social safeguards. LGBTQ+ families in particular expressed concern about weakened protections and hostile rhetoric. Parents of transgender youth felt their children were at risk, fearing reduced legal support and heightened discrimination at school and in public life. Major European research institutes and Canadian tech hubs noticed an uptick in interest from highly qualified Americans. Though the numbers remained small, economists warned that a sustained brain drain could eventually erode the United States' innovative edge. In parts of the U.S., local governments attempted to cushion the blow by organizing new community markets. These measures provided temporary relief but did not offset higher transportation costs, which continued to climb under the new tariffs. Alaska felt the pain acutely. Companies scrambled for alternate routes, some experimenting with shipping goods by sea despite the added expense and delays. Others tried to purchase directly from Canadian suppliers, but fluctuating tariffs complicated every deal. Tourism boards in Alaska warned that uncertainty would devastate local businesses if cruise lines scaled back itineraries. Gift shops, restaurants, and tour operators faced existential threats, having little recourse without a diplomatic breakthrough. Analysts cautioned that if the U.S. and Canada remained at loggerheads, North America's economic architecture could shift profoundly. The United States, entangled in multiple trade spats, risked eroding global goodwill and access to vital markets. In Canadian political circles, debate split between those favoring hardline tactics against Washington and others urging dialogue. Both factions recognized the dangers of a protracted trade war, but remained divided on the best path forward. Energy experts warned that if Canada curtailed oil supplies, gas prices in the U.S. could spike further, adding to inflationary pressures. Such a move would also hurt Canada, but might serve as strategic leverage should tensions escalate further. Low-income families and smaller businesses on both sides bore the brunt of the discord. Rising consumer prices, job insecurity, and strained social services produced a sense of helplessness and mounting frustration among ordinary citizens. Efforts to convene a high-level summit remained stalled by conflicting demands. Negotiations faltered as each nation accused the other of unfair practices. Industry leaders lamented the absence of statesmanship capable of halting the spiral. Some Americans and Canadians turned to grassroots activism, reminding both governments of their long history of cooperation. Online campaigns called for cooler heads to prevail, urging policymakers to seek compromise rather than endless retaliation. Meanwhile, the White House's unpredictable positions left businesses in perpetual limbo, delaying future investments. Stock market volatility persisted, fueled by the fear that no near-term resolution would emerge for this international standoff. In Canada, provinces such as Quebec and Ontario faced pressure to impose their own tariffs on American goods, mirroring British Columbia's tough stance. This internal balancing act underscored Canada's challenge of remaining unified amid regional pressures. Economic forecasters painted a troubling picture if the dispute dragged on. They predicted continued price hikes, shortages in certain industries, and potential realignment of entire supply chains away from North America's once thriving partnership. Without a coordinated approach, the clash could ultimately undermine both nations' competitiveness on the world stage. The cost of protecting certain domestic sectors might be overshadowed by the harm done to broader economic stability and diplomatic relations. Still, political will for swift resolution seemed lacking. Each administration insisted that any concession would appear as weakness. Commentators speculated that political optics were taking precedence over the real needs of affected communities. Back in Alaska, local leaders pleaded for some form of special exemption or reduced tariffs, arguing that their unique geography made them unfairly vulnerable. Yet no relief materialized. Talk of rerouting through alternative regions remained prohibitively expensive. Tour operators reported cancellations for the coming season, prompted by uncertainty around new fees and potential border slowdowns. Many feared that once visitors found other destinations, those customers might not return. Yet a few voices on Capitol Hill pushed for a diplomatic meeting. They argued that a continuing rift with America's most significant neighbor would do lasting damage. Others countered that concessions could sabotage domestic production goals. Ultimately, the entire saga highlighted the fragility of interdependence. For decades, the U.S. and Canada thrived on open borders, integrated supply chains, and a sense of mutual trust. Now, that trust was eroding under the weight of tariff after tariff. Alaskans, stuck at the forefront of these tensions, had the most to lose. Every day without resolution meant steeper shipping costs, diminishing profit margins, and the potential departure of industries that once thrived on affordable transportation. Across the mainland United States, some questioned whether the strategy of aggressive tariffs even served national interests. As prices rose and global alliances shifted, the debate over whether a trade war was truly winnable intensified. Canada, meanwhile, invested further in diversifying its partnerships, forging ties with Asia and Europe, If those relationships proved fruitful, Canada might become less reliant on the U.S. long-term, transforming the North American trade landscape permanently. Amid all these developments, one question hovered. Could cooler diplomacy avert a full-blown economic disaster? As pressure mounted from businesses, farmers, and everyday citizens, the hope for a negotiated settlement still flickered. For many observers, the lesson was clear. Once locked into a cycle of protectionist measures, even close allies could devolve into adversarial stances. The fallout served as a stark warning that protectionism can unravel decades of mutual cooperation. Alaska's plight also underscored the human cost. Families confronted with higher grocery bills, small businesses losing tourist traffic, and workers facing potential layoffs were all collateral damage in a struggle far beyond their control. As the conflict persisted, shifting alliances reshaped international trade patterns. Global capitals weighed how to leverage the chaos for their advantage, forging new deals that might sideline the United States from markets once considered secure. In the end, both Americans and Canadians confronted an uncomfortable truth. Neither nation was immune to the consequences of broken trust. When defensive tariffs become the norm, the lines between friend and rival can blur in startling ways. Still, pockets of optimism remained. Citizens petitioned their representatives for serious talks, urging both sides to remember their shared history and consider the real people harmed by these policies. Online petitions and rallies drew attention to the crisis. Despite the anger and uncertainty, many hoped that cooler heads would ultimately guide the region back toward collaboration. After all, the ties binding the U.S. and Canada went beyond trade. They were cultural, familial, and generational. Whether this prolonged crisis will push both countries to adopt lasting reforms or deepen the wedge remains unclear. But one thing is certain: the fallout from a trade war can cast a very long shadow, especially when it divides neighbors long united in friendship.